Hello, this is Steve Roman. This is the second video describing the content of my book, A Primer on Folding Knives. In this video, I want to talk about Chapter 2, which is steel metallurgy. My goals in this chapter were to talk about the properties of steel that are relevant to knife blades, such as toughness, hardness, edge retention, and corrosion resistance. To talk about the basic process that steel undergoes in order to become a knife blade, that's the heat treatment process. And to take a look at what happens at the molecular level as the steel goes through that heat treatment process. So the chapter starts with the properties of steel. I describe toughness and hardness and wear resistance, edge retention, corrosion resistance. Then I talk about some hardness tests, including the Rockwell C test, which is the most common test for knife blades, and the Knopp test for hardness, with some values for comparison. I also talk about the Mohs scale, which is a scratch resistance test. Then I take a closer look at toughness with some charts here. The main focus here is on something called the yield stress. If you use a knife blade to, say, pry something, or if it's subjected to stress that tends to bend the blade, then as long as the stress is less than the yield stress for that particular steel, the blade will undergo what is called elastic deformation, and then when the stress is removed, the blade will come back to its original shape, which is good, of course. But if you exceed the yield stress, then the blade will undergo plastic deformation and will not recover its original shape when the stress is relieved. And that, of course, is bad. So I talk at length about that, the stress and strain, the deformation, tensile strength, and ductility, and so on. The next item is just a quick look at the heat treatment process. Excuse me. There are 4 steps: preheating, austenitizing, quenching, and tempering. And I'll just go into those briefly, and I'll go into more detail later on. Then I turn to the composition of steel, starting with the types of steel: pure carbon, plain carbon. Carbon steel is a term that gets used differently by different people. Some people just mean non-stainless steel, but there is a more technical definition of carbon steel. Alloy steel, stainless steel. Talk about rust and the effect of chromium, which tends to provide corrosion resistance. Then I talk about the structure of pure iron, which is a good starting point for understanding what's going on at the molecular level. Iron can take one of 2 crystal forms, body-centered and face-centered. The body-centered form is a cube with 8 iron atoms at the corners and 1 iron atom in the center. That's the black dot. The face-centered form has 8 iron atoms at the corners, but instead of 1 in the center, it has 6 iron atoms on the faces. This is a little more maybe realistic look at face-centered iron crystals. The iron atoms sort of bump into each other, but there are spaces in between called interstitial spaces, and that's where carbon can be. I also mentioned that steel has a grainy structure, that individual crystals form grains, so you get something that's kind of pictured here. This is a micrograph of low carbon content steel. I mentioned a link here on Wikipedia where you can actually watch the grain growing in the steel. That's pretty interesting. The body-centered form of iron is called ferrite, and the face-centered form is called austenite. That's named after a gentleman named Sir William Chandler Roberts Austin. And ferrite and austenite have quite different properties, which I talk about. The main one of which is the fact that austenite can absorb far more carbon than ferrite, many times more. And that's very important for knife making because carbon adds hardness to the steel. Pure iron is quite soft and it would not make a good knife blade. So in order to produce a knife blade, you have to heat iron, and that will change the iron from ferrite to austenite. At a temperature of 912 degrees centigrade, that's called the transition temperature. Below that temperature, iron is in the ferrite form, body-centered. Above that temperature, iron exists in austenite form, which is the face-centered form that will absorb more carbon. So you need to heat the iron in order to get it to absorb more carbon. Even still, there is a limit to how much an austenite crystal can absorb carbon. The carbon has to fit between the iron atoms, and they will separate a little bit, but there is a limit to how much they will separate. Excess carbon will form compounds with iron. It'll form iron carbide, which is called cementite. Then I discussed two experiments which show what happens if you heat a type of steel, 1095, to 760 degrees centigrade, or if you heat it to 820 degrees centigrade for 20 minutes and then drop it down to 760 degrees centigrade. There's a big difference in the final result. In the first case, while there's the distribution of cementite grains, which are small, is pretty uniform among the larger austenite grains. But in the second case, where we went up to 820 degrees centigrade, the cementite grains formed or distributed in the boundaries between the austenite grains. Now, cementite is very brittle, and so if you just look at these two pictures, you can see that the second experiment is going to produce a more brittle form of steel. So this is kind of an illustration of the fact that just 60 degrees of temperature for a few minutes can make a dramatic difference in the outcome and the properties of the steel. Next, I go into the heat treatment process in much more detail. Preheating, austenitizing, which is the process of heating the iron until it changes from ferrite to austenite so it can absorb more carbon. Then I talk about quenching, which is rapid cooling of the steel after it's been austenitized. I also talk about slow cooling to give you a perspective on the difference between what happens when you cool the steel slowly and when you cool it rapidly. When you cool the steel rapidly, there's not time for the carbon atoms that are lodged in between the iron atoms in the interstitial spaces of the iron crystal to escape. And as a result, the structure is deformed into something called martensite. And this is a picture of martensite compared to ferrite. It's an elongated, it's no longer a cube, it's an elongated tetragon. The result of the quenching, besides being a different form, crystal form, martensite, is the result is very brittle. In fact, it's so brittle that some steels will just crack spontaneously at room temperature without touching them. So something has to be done to deal with that brittleness, and that's where tempering comes in. So I talk about the tempering process. Next up is the effect of carbon on the toughness and hardness of steel. Here's a chart that relates to the toughness of steel, the effect of carbon on toughness. The effect of carbon on hardness is discussed next with a chart, a graph I should say, showing that the Rockwell C hardness is maximum somewhere around 0.8% carbon content. But this, now we're talking just about plain carbon steel, so it's just carbon and iron. Alloys have an effect on this. We'll change the picture here. So the next discussion is about alloyed steel and how different alloys can change the properties of the steel by increasing hardness and toughness and so on, but also brittleness, and can reduce grain size, which is a good thing. Generally speaking, steels with a smaller grain will hold a sharper edge, will take a sharper edge. So I talk more about hardness and hardenability. Then I talk about powder metallurgy. Before the steel undergoes heat treatment, it is annealed generally, and that's melting of the steel and a slow cooling to relieve internal stress primarily. But what can happen, what does happen, is that as the steel cools slowly, the alloys that have been placed in the steel mixture will segregate, and so you will end up with a non-homogeneous mixture, which is not good. You'll have clumps of alloy in various places. Powder metallurgy is a technique to deal with that problem. Next up is some steel brands. I just make a list of some steel brands so you'll recognize them with relative comparisons. There's a chart that shows some of the different properties, wear resistance and chipping resistance, which is toughness, for different steels from Crucible Industries, just to give you an idea. The last item in this chapter is a little discussion, a story you might say. What do you do if you find a knife you like, but it has a steel you've never heard of? One maybe that's not so common. Well, that happened to me. I was in a knife store and I saw a fixed blade knife I really liked, but I had never heard of the steel before. So I didn't buy the knife right away. I started to do some research to see what I could learn about the steel. And this is the story of what I went through. It took quite a while, actually, to do enough research to convince myself that it was a steel that would work well for what I had intended, and so I bought the knife. So that's the end of that chapter, and I'll do another video on chapter 3. Thanks for watching.